They teach you in school that World War I started because someone shot an archduke. But what if I told you millions of people died in trenches not because of a bullet, but because Britain was terrified of a train? The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was supposed to connect Europe to the Middle East. It was just iron tracks and wooden sleepers. But this single railway line scared the British Empire so much that they were willing to destroy an entire region to stop it. And the chaos we see in the Middle East today, the borders that make no sense, the wars that never end, all of it traces back to a railway that was never allowed to exist. Picture the world in 1900. Britain ruled everything. They had the biggest navy, they controlled the seas, and most importantly, they controlled the Suez Canal in Egypt. That canal was the shortcut to India and Asia. If you wanted to trade with the East, you had to go through British territory. You had to ask permission. You had to play by their rules. But there was a problem brewing in Europe. Germany had just unified a few decades earlier and they were getting strong. Really strong. Their factories were pumping out more steel than Britain. Their scientists were winning Nobel Prizes. But Germany had no empire that could rival Britain's navy. They were trapped in the middle of Europe, surrounded by rivals, cut off from global trade by British ships. Meanwhile, to the southeast, the Ottoman Empire was dying. For hundreds of years, they had been powerful. But by the late 1800s, everyone called them the sick man of Europe. They were drowning in debt. British and French banks had loaned them so much money that by 1881, the Ottomans went bankrupt. Completely broke. To pay back the loans, European bankers literally took over their economy. They created something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. These foreign bankers collected taxes directly from Ottoman citizens. If a Turkish farmer sold wheat or silk, a cut of that money didn't go to his government, it went straight to London or Paris. The Sultan was watching his empire get eaten alive by foreign vultures. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was desperate. He needed to modernize his country without giving even more control to the Europeans. He needed railways to move his army quickly, to connect his empire, to defend his borders. But if he asked Britain or France to build them, they'd just tighten the leash even more. This is where Germany saw an opportunity. Kaiser Wilhelm II had a vision. What if Germany built a railway from Berlin all the way to Baghdad, down to the Persian Gulf? Think about what that means. German goods could travel by train through Austria, through the Balkans, into Turkey, and all the way to the Indian Ocean without ever seeing a British warship. It would bypass the entire British naval blockade. It would connect German industrial power with Middle Eastern resources. For the Sultan, this was a lifeline. For Germany, this was their path to becoming a superpower. For Britain, this was their worst nightmare. Construction started with German money and German engineers. Deutsche Bank put up the cash. The engineering was incredible. They had to blast through mountains, lay tracks across burning deserts, build bridges over rivers. It was one of the greatest infrastructure projects of its time. And as the tracks moved east, London started panicking. British strategists looked at their maps and saw the danger. If this railway got finished, German troops could threaten the Suez Canal. German merchants could flood India with cheap goods. The entire British system of control would collapse. But there was something even bigger at stake. Oil. This was the moment when navies were switching from coal to oil. Oil burned hotter, ships moved faster, and Britain's Admiral Fisher said the fleet must convert to oil or die. But Britain had no oil. They got it from Persia and America. And geologists had just discovered that the land the railway would cross, the territory we now call Iraq, was sitting on an ocean of oil. Germany had secured the rights to all minerals within 20 kilometers on both sides of the track. If they finished this railway, they would control the oil that the British Navy needed to survive. Game over. The British decided this railway could never reach the sea. They used every weapon they had. First, they did secret deals with local rulers. They convinced the Sheikh of Kuwait to sign an agreement promising not to lease any land to foreigners without British permission. This blocked the railway from having a port on the Persian Gulf. The train would lead to nowhere. Then they used propaganda. British newspapers ran stories calling the Ottomans barbarians and the Germans evil for supporting them. They painted the railway as a tool of tyranny, not trade. And they used finance. The City of London refused to let any British money touch the project. They tried to starve it of cash. But the Germans kept building. By 1914, the tracks had pushed deep into Turkey. The threat was becoming real. This is the context you need to understand World War I. Yes, an archduke got shot. But the real tensions were about who would control the economic future of the planet. Britain, France, and Russia formed an alliance specifically to surround Germany and stop its expansion. Russia wanted to crush the Ottomans. France feared German dominance. Britain feared for Suez and India. When war broke out, the first place Britain looked wasn't Berlin. It was the Middle East. They sent troops to Basra in southern Iraq immediately. Their official reason was to protect an oil refinery. Their real goal was to march north and capture the oil fields before Germany could get them. They were following the path of the unfinished railway. The tragedy for the Ottoman Empire was brutal. They joined Germany's side, hoping a German victory would free them from debt. They thought the railway would bring German weapons and soldiers to save them. But they miscalculated how ruthless Britain could be. The war in the Middle East was hell. Soldiers died of heat stroke and disease. The British suffered humiliating defeats at first, like when an entire British army had to surrender at Kut. But Britain had endless resources and the Ottomans were running on empty. And here's the killer detail. The railway that was supposed to save them wasn't finished. There were gaps in the tracks through the mountains. German supplies had to be unloaded, carried by truck and camel over mountain passes, then loaded back onto trains. This bottleneck strangled the Ottoman war effort. If the railway had been completed 5 years earlier, the entire war might have ended differently. While the war was still raging, two diplomats named Mark Sykes and Sykes-Picot sat down with a map and a pencil. In 1916, they drew lines across the Middle East. They ignored tribes, religions, geography, everything. But if you look closely at the Sykes-Picot lines, they match almost perfectly with the route of the Baghdad Railway and the locations of oil deposits. Britain took southern Iraq and the port of Haifa in Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. They carved up the Ottoman corpse to make sure no single power could ever threaten them again. The railway that was meant to unite the region became the knife that divided it. The Arabs had been promised freedom if they rebelled against the Ottomans. Lawrence of Arabia led revolts, blowing up railway lines. But when the war ended, they didn't get independence. They got British and French colonial rule instead. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved. The Sultan was removed. The Caliphate was abolished. And the debt? It wasn't forgiven. It was just restructured and passed on to the new puppet nations. Britain had won. They stopped Germany. They secured the route to India. They grabbed the oil. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was cut into pieces, scattered across Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. It never worked as the unified trade route it was designed to be. The dream died. But the consequences didn't. The destruction of that railway and the Ottoman Empire left a mess we are still dealing with today. The borders drawn by Sykes and Picot ignored reality. They created countries that made no sense. Iraq, Syria, Jordan, these weren't real nations with shared histories. They were lines on a map designed to keep the region weak and divided. After World War II, America took over where Britain left off. Different empire, same obsession with controlling the Middle East. During the Cold War, they feared Soviet tanks pouring through the same mountain passes the railway would have crossed. And today? Look at China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's the Baghdad Railway on steroids. China is building railways, highways, and pipelines across Eurasia to bypass American naval power. The United States is reacting in eerily familiar ways. Same fear. Same strategy. Same propaganda about debt traps and supporting dictators. The story of the Baghdad Railway teaches us that infrastructure is never just infrastructure. A train line is never just a train line. It's a weapon. It's a threat. It's a redistribution of power. And empires will burn the world down before they let rivals control the flow of trade. When you see the news about wars in Iraq, Syria, or Iran, they tell you it's about religion or terrorism or democracy. But dig through the sand and history, and you'll find rusted railway tracks that were never finished. You'll find the proof that the Middle East was broken on purpose to stop a train. The train that never arrived is still destroying the world. If you recognize these patterns playing out somewhere else today, you already know what comes next. History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming.